Good evening, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theater. Today, we're going to continue our dive into stones to Abbigale. Chapter 10. The next morning, I was surprised Davis didn't leap up to greet me as I walked on the bus with Abby. We sat across from him, but he just looked out his window, surrounding himself in a silent gloom while paying us no attention. "Hey, Davis, how are you today?" I asked. Davis replied without turning towards me. "Why don't you have a car? You're 17. Only losers like me ride the bus." Abby gave me a look of concern. Though Abby didn't know Davis too well yet, she understood him to be a happier person. Neither of us expected Davis to say something so negative. I responded to Davis. "Not everyone has a white picket fence life, Davis. Some people have to ride the bus." Davis turned angrily and spoke as he pierced me with the most intense glare I had ever seen. "You don't think I know that? You should get a job. Buy your own car. What are you even doing with your life?" I sat back, giving up on changing his mood, and thought to myself, happiness, as far as I care, can't be acquired through any means if love is not involved. If I got a job on top of school, I'd have barely any time to spend with Abby. I needed her more than anything, and I thought Davis knew this. Davis was probably just upset over everything that had happened recently, and this was his way of coping. Trying to close the conversation on a less negative note, I said, "Well, buddy, I'm here if you need me," with the same tone he always used on me. He rolled his eyes, scoffed, and scooted closer to his window. Abby remained next to me, running her fingers over the hairs on my hand. It was such a positive distraction. Later that morning, I found myself in history class staring at a very nervous Mr. Hanson. I can't remember my Mr. Hanson voice. Wait. Later that morning, I found myself in my history class staring at a very nervous Mr. Hanson. "You'll all realize the President of the United States is going to be here, right?" he asked the class, most of the students looking confused as we're not briefed when exactly we would see him. A voice erupted as our classroom door was swiftly pushed open. "The President of the United States is about to arrive, ladies and gentlemen," said a large man wearing a black suit. Mr. Hanson laughed nervously over the fact that what we soon realized was a member of the Secret Service had overheard him. Mr. Hanson turned to the class in a rushed tone and said, "All right, think before you ask the President anything. No stupid questions." Another voice came from out the door. "You're right, Mr. Hanson. There are no stupid questions." We all froze to see it was the President who had spoken. As he walked in the room, I quickly realized he was much taller than I had assumed from watching TV. The President centered himself in the room as the Secret Service asked Mr. Hanson to take a seat at his desk. "That's it. Book over. Book over. That's it. That's it. Book over." I'll have to apologize. God, where was I? I'm just going to back up. As he walked in the room, I quickly realized he was much taller than I had assumed from watching TV. The president centered himself in the room as the Secret Service asked Mr. Hansen to take a seat at his desk. 4 members of the USSS stood behind the president as he began to speak. I'm not here to bring a dark cloud into this room. I want to be uplifting, to be helpful, and I want all of you to feel like you can say whatever you want without any fear, criticism, or repercussions. Chris Jenkins, the class clown, blurted out, "Why are you such a D-bag?" Most everyone in the class sat in shock as Mr. Hansen violently lurched up like a frantic animal, yelling in a high-pitched tone, "Chris, how dare you disrespect the..." "Mr. Hansen," the president interrupted, "thank you." A USS member then asked Mr. Hansen to return to his seat. The president walked over to Chris, pulling his own pants back so he could crouch. "Now, you may feel I am what you said, a D-bag, but you should know to address me as President D-bag, and I, as many Americans believe I have earned the title of president." Chris, now shaking and not knowing what to say, let out a nervous and horribly awkward chuckle. The president smiled and returned to the front of the room as he said, "Now what other questions do you all have for me?" Literally everyone in class, aside from Chris, raised their hand. The president looked directly at me and said, "James Patrick, the boy who nearly saved the day, what is your question?" I replied, "You know who I am?" He responded, "I've read up on this school and the recent events quite a bit. How are your feet healing up?" I was overwhelmed, but I had to keep it together, so I quickly replied, "Well, really, actually, the ambulance guys did an amazing job getting the glass and the dirt out." The president followed with, "Well, that's wonderful to hear. What was your question?" I replied, "I just wanted to know how you feel about the things people call you in the news and around the world and stuff." The president gave a slightly sad smile and replied, "I cannot and I do not want control of what people say about me. All I can really fully control is what I am myself saying and doing. I find myself repeatedly stating that when I came into office with the best intentions, and I continue to lead as president with those very same intentions. Some decisions I have to make aren't always fair to me, my family, or many people around the world, but sometimes your only options lie between the end of a slip knot or the blade of a guillotine. And that's the burden I chose to carry." The class paused for a few seconds, and then all at once everyone but Chris and myself raised their hands again. One of the USS members spoke up, "Mr. President, we need to move on." The president lifted his hand and said to the class, "I want you all to know there are going to be some major changes around your school. I've approved a budget shift that will help fund significant renovations and an effective security program that will promote a safer environment for everyone here. I will not stand by and do nothing while these incidents occur. So I'm doing what any responsible person in my position would do, is make you feel safer in this environment of learning." He then smiled as the USSS opened the door behind him. "Thank you all. And Chris, remember our talk, okay?" Chris remained speechless as the president walked out. Mr. Hansen then stood up a while looking at Chris. as if he had just slapped Mr. Hansen's mother right in front of him. Mr. Hansen maintained his glare as he walked to the front of the class. Mr. Hansen sighed deeply and looked down at the floor. He then asked, "Did anyone else almost pass out?" He then erupted with laughter as the teacher wiped sweat from his forehead with the towel he used as a whiteboard eraser. The towel smeared ink all over his forehead, which made us laugh even harder. Unfortunately, I was faced with the reality that he would blame his humiliation on me if I did not tell him right away, as my next period still required I act as a teacher's assistant for him. The first thing Abby said to me when I met with her later that day in gym class was, "So it looks like Miss Stanley is getting a new desk." I replied, "The president?" "Yep, he met with you guys too?" I nodded, and she added, "In other news, Jason has been hitting on me. Not sure what to do about it." I replied, concerned. "Just like a little flirting, or is it heavy?" She answered, "I think the whole saving our lives thing went to his head. He just grabbed my butt in class after the president left the room." I went silent. Trying to reassure me, she said, "I yelled at him not to do it again." I replied, "Did you talk to the teacher?" She answered, "Miss Stanley saw I was uncomfortable and said she would give him detentions if he tried to do it again." I loved that she did everything I would have done, leaving no room for me to imagine potential alternatives to what she felt about Jason's chauvinistic act. I smiled slightly and said, "Well, thank you for telling me, Abby." She interrupted, "What about you? Any girls grabbing your butt these days?" I replied with a slight smile, "No. Guess my butt isn't as good looking as yours, Abby." She squealed and hugged me as the substitute walked in and blew his whistle. Oh, it's gym class. "All right, everyone. Let's play some badminton," the substitute teacher said, pronouncing everything as if it were spelled. Raymond responded, "Don't you mean badminton?" The teacher replied, "I didn't, Ray man. Is that okay with you?" Now angered, he responded, "It's Raymond." The sub laughed and said, "All right, everyone. Do you want to see Rayman versus your sub in a badminton?" A lot of us screamed, "Yeah!" And so the game ensued. Okay. And so the game ensued. Ramon seemed to get hit with the birdie more than the actual racket did. We kept laughing because he was trying so hard to look cool, but kept failing repeatedly, and as a result looked completely goofy. After the teacher had scored on him for like the 10th time, Ramon threw down the racket. The teacher loudly asked, "So is that game? No more badminton." Trying to sound tough, Raymond screamed, "This is a sissy game anyway." Someone watching yelled to everyone, Uh-oh, watch out or he might try to shoot us too." We all went silent. One girl jumped up and walked off in a hurry. I could see she was holding her cries in until she could get out of the room. Raymond angrily looked over the persons who made the comment. The individual who yelled put their head down. They were obviously trying to avoid being pierced by Raymond's glare. Raymond then fiercely walked off, throwing a tantrum by kicking a garbage can while pulling off his shirt as he passed through the boys' locker room entrance. "All right, everyone, pick a partner and start playing," the teacher said just before following Ramon into the locker room. Naturally, Abby was on my team, and we played against a couple of people who were equally unenthusiastic about the sport, so we basically just stood around talking about how dorky our uniforms were and basically anything we could do to keep our minds preoccupied. How about some fucking badminton? Later that night at dinner, we had to put together a makeshift chair for Rick as Abby was still staying with us. My mom began to talk about their move. "So Rick let me know he's happy to help cover your food and utilities, etc., while you stay here in the condo," she said. Abby and I looked at each other happily and hugged excitingly that it was confirmed. Abby and I didn't have to move anywhere. My mom continued, "Your sister is going to come and live with us." I looked at my sister and asked, "What's up, sis?" She just pushed food around on her plate and mumbled, "It's whatever. I don't want to talk about it." My mom gave a look that I should just drop it. So I did. Abby squeezed my hand. She was still smiling widely to me. I was pretty overwhelmed with what this all meant as well. One of the greatest pending burdens hovering over my head had been removed from my life completely. However ridiculous it sounds, knowing I could be separated from Abby, to me, was the equivalent of a doctor telling me that I might have cancer, only to reveal later it was nothing. I felt like I was getting my life back, without it having been taken away in the first place. After dinner, Abby and I cuddled in bed while listening to some of her favorite bands. She would sing along to the songs, knowing most of the words, as I just kept my eyes closed, paying close attention to how soft her skin felt pressed against mine. In that room alone with her, I often found myself feeling like nothing else mattered. She gave all my senses something to devour to the point where I began to feel like the rest of my world barely existed at all. I fell asleep listening to the sound of her beautiful voice, softly singing. It's official. Mr. Hansen does get told to take a seat. This has been Doctorpiece Theater, and my name is Dr. Dennis Business. And as always, my friends,